It's an honor and pleasure to introduce our main speaker, author of the new Pearl Harbor, Disturbing Questions About the Bush Administration and 9/11, and the 9/11 Commission Report, Omissions and Distortions, a critique of the Keene-Zelikow Report. By deconstructing the foundational lies of the war on terrorism, courageously dispelling fear to champion truth and light the path towards a hopeful future, Dr. Griffin is an inspiration to all who reject fear, terror, war, and lies, and to all who cherish life, health, peace, and truth. The fact that he can enjoy challenging the most threatening empire the world has ever seen makes it possible and compelling for all of us to join him in this journey. Please welcome Dr. David Ray Griffin.
Good evening. Although I have given many lectures about 9/11, I had, prior to this one, never devoted an entire lecture to simply summarizing what I take to be the strongest evidence against the official account of 9/11. For one thing, the Pentagon's West Wing was struck, but terrorists brilliant enough to get through the U.S. military's defense system would have known that this was the worst place to strike, for several reasons. The West Wing had been reinforced, so the damage was less severe than a strike anywhere else would have been. This wing was still being renovated, so relatively few people were there. A strike anywhere else would have killed thousands rather than 125. And the Secretary of Defense and all the top brass, whom terrorists would presumably have wanted to kill, were in the East Wing. Why would an al-Qaeda pilot hit the West Wing when he could have simply crashed into the roof of the East Wing? A second major problem with the official story. There are reasons to believe that the Pentagon was struck only because officials at the Pentagon wanted it to be struck. For one thing, Flight 77, after making a U-turn in the Midwest, flew back to Washington allegedly undetected for 40 minutes. And yet the U.S. military, which by then clearly would have known that hijacked airliners were being used as weapons, has the best radar systems in the world, one of which, it brags, does not miss anything occurring in North American airspace. The idea that a large airliner could have slipped through is absurd. Also, the Pentagon is surely the best defended building on the planet. It is not only within the P-56A restricted airspace that extends 17 miles in all directions from the Washington Monument, but also within the P-56B airspace, the 3-mile ultra-restricted zone above the White House, the Capitol, and the Pentagon. The Pentagon is only a few miles from Andrews Air Force Base, which has at least 3 squadrons with fighter jets on alert at all times. The claim by the 9/11 Commission report that no fighters were on alert the morning of 9/11 is wholly implausible, as I have explained in my book on this subject. To conclude, it would seem for many reasons that the official story of 9/11, which has served as a religious myth in the intervening years, is a myth in the pejorative sense of a story that does not correspond with reality. One sign that a story is a myth in this sense, I have pointed out, is that it cannot be rationally defended. The government story is myth, not reality. We must demand that the government immediately cease implementing the policies that have been warranted by the official account of 9/11. For this story, serving as a national religious myth, has been used to justify 2 wars, which have cost many tens of thousands of deaths, to start a more general war on radical Islam, in which Muslims around the world are now considered guilty until proven innocent, to annul and violate civil rights, and to increase our military spending, which was already greater than all the spending of the rest of the world together. And yet now we've increased it by several more billions of dollars, much of this being used to put weapons in space. Congress needs to put the implementation of these policies on hold until there is a truly independent investigation carried out by qualified individuals who are not members of the very circles that, if 9/11 truly was a false flag operation, planned it, carried it out, and then covered it up. Thank you very much for your attention. After being told by several people that I needed to look into this because it looked like the government was complicit, and for a while I would look at possible websites and so on, and I didn't find it convincing. And finally I found Paul Thompson's work, which has now been published as a book called The Terror Timeline. And it had an amazing amount of material drawn from strictly mainline sources that simply contradicted the official account. So I started reading more and more stuff, and I read Nafiz Ahmed's book, The War on Freedom. I read then Terry Mason's book on Pentagate and 9/11, The Big Lie. And then I did learn more about what was going on the internet. I never had been an internet person. And I saw that a lot of people have been working on this for a long time, but most of them were people who would never be able to get a book published. And I thought, well, since I've published about 25 books before, maybe I would have a shot at it. Even then, it was much more difficult than I thought. Most publishers simply wouldn't respond to my letters. But I kept at it till I found brave little Interlink Books, which was willing to do it. And so first of all, I just thought it was a duty, the fact that this enormous amount of research had been done, and that it certainly presented a credible case that people needed to know about, and that maybe I was in position to bring that to the public. So for the most part, the new Pearl Harbor has hardly any original material in it. It's mainly just an organization of work that other people has done, and a presentation of it in a fairly brief and fairly readable way. So that was the primary motivation. Certainly, I was also motivated by these other concerns. As a theologian, I'm committed to the good of the whole universe, the good of the whole earth. And if it looks like there is a gang that has gotten control of our government and our purse strings to use it for very selfish and imperialistic purposes, then that needs to be exposed. There has been a long history. We're sitting here in California. We stole this from the Mexicans by deliberately fabricating an incident where we were on their property, and then they were accused of shedding American blood on American property. The congressman at the time named Abraham Lincoln called this a shameless lie. Likewise, when we took over Cuba, the Philippines, and Hawaii, and a few other islands, Puerto Rico and Guam and so on, there was a battleship there in the harbor just put down there for nobody knows quite why. And there was a big explosion on the battleship. This, of course, the battleship Maine, and everybody knows the slogan, "Remember the Maine, the hell was Spain." And it's still a mystery exactly what happened, but we certainly used it as an incident and accused Spain falsely of having blown up the Maine. That's the last thing Spain would have done. Likewise, the war in the Philippines the following year was started by an incident that the soldier in charge admitted that he was told to start the war as an incident, and so on. And more recently, people know about the Gulf of Tonkin, that those events never happened, which were really when the Vietnam War went full scale. So there is a long history, and there's also the famous or notorious Operations Northwoods document. When General Eisenhower was just about to leave office, he desperately wanted to invade Cuba to get rid of Fidel Castro, but time ran out. The plan passed over to President Kennedy, but then there was the little Bay of Pigs fiasco. Kennedy took Cuban planning away from the CIA, gave it to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They came in with this plan, which would involve killing American citizens and blaming the Cubans as a pretext to invade Cuba. Kennedy turned it down. Another president might have accepted it. But those documents have now been published, and many people know about them through James Bamford's work, House of Secrets, about the National Security Agency. So there is a long history of planning, fabricating incidents. There's a whole question about the original Pearl Harbor, which I don't go into in my book, but certainly Robert Stinnett has made a very strong claim for the old idea, but he gives much more evidence for it, that we knew full well that those attacks were coming, and in fact that we actually squeezed the Japanese until they believed they had no choice but to make that preemptive attack. So yes, there is a very long history. So many people who reject the idea that there could be any kind of conspiracy do it on an a priori basis. They say, well, our government would never do such a thing. Our military, they're so protective of human rights and the precious sacredness of every human life. They would never do anything like this. Well, people just need to learn the history and realize that 3,000 lives taken on 9/11, in terms of the kind of cost-benefit analysis that the military is trained to do and that the CIA is trained to do, this was a very, what they would call high cost-benefit operation. When you look at Vietnam, that enterprise, you're talking about tens of thousands of Americans killed after we knew the war was futile, after we knew we could not win, and we were simply fighting to save American credibility. Tens of thousands were sacrificed. So to kill 3,000 on 9/11, given that kind of mindset that thinks in those terms, this was not a bad price to pay. Well, the immediate thing, of course, is if you become convinced you've got criminals in the White House, get rid of them. More long-term, we need to overcome plutocracy. Plutocracy is, where democracy is ruled by the people, of the people, for the people. Plutocracy is ruled by the rich, of the rich, for the rich. And we have a system now in which the richest 1 to 5% of the country calls the shots for America, and therefore calls the shots for the world. So we need to, this may sound simplistic, but the biggest single step we could take would be to get rid of all private financing of elections. That's why these politicians cannot tell the truth. That's why they can't buck the corporations. That's why we only get rich people or people who are sponsored by rich corporations who can run for national office. So we need public financing so that honest people can get in the government and pass laws, and then we can get honest people in the White House who will execute those laws. So I would say that would be the next thing. And thirdly, work for global democracy, and in my forthcoming books I'll be describing the reasons for that.